There are television shows that entertain you, and then there are television shows that quietly rewire the way you think about family, failure, and the American dream. Married with Children was the second kind. For 11 seasons, it invited millions of viewers into the Bundy living room every Sunday night, where a defeated shoe salesman named Al Bundy sat on a couch with his hand down his pants, staring at a television set like a man who had made peace with his own disappointment. Audiences laughed. They laughed every single week for over a decade. But Ed O'Neill, the man who gave Al Bundy his soul, has spent years trying to explain something that most fans never quite grasped. What they were laughing at was never just a joke. It was something far more complicated, far more personal, and far more honest than anyone in Hollywood intended it to be. When Married with Children first entered development in the mid-1980s, it was a radical idea wrapped in a deceptively simple premise. Creators Michael Moy and Ron Levitt were tired of the warm, aspirational family sitcoms dominating American television. Shows like The Cosby Show presented families as loving, functional, and financially comfortable. Moy and Levitt wanted to do the exact opposite. They wanted to create a family that was broke, bickering, and completely uninterested in personal growth. The idea was satire, a comedic mirror held up to the parts of middle-class American life that nobody wanted to talk about in polite company. Fox, a network that was barely breathing at the time, took the gamble. They needed something that would separate them from NBC, ABC, and CBS. Something provocative. Something that would make people talk. But even with all of that creative ambition behind the project, nobody in the room initially understood just how deeply the show would connect with ordinary Americans. What they thought they were making was a boundary-pushing comedy. What they actually made was an accidental portrait of working-class disillusionment that would resonate with millions of people who felt invisible to mainstream culture. Ed O'Neill understood this from the very beginning, even if he could not have articulated it in those terms at the time. When he walked into the audition, he did not arrive with a flashy performance or an attempt to be broadly funny. He arrived with something quieter and more unsettling. He arrived with exhaustion. He later recalled drawing on memories of the men he had grown up around in Youngstown, Ohio. Men who had worked hard, expected more from life, and somewhere along the way quietly surrendered to the gap between their dreams and their reality. That specific weariness, that particular brand of American disappointment, was something the creators immediately recognized as irreplaceable. Ed was not performing Al Bundy. In many ways, he was channeling an entire generation of men that television had never bothered to acknowledge. What most fans never understood about Married with Children is how technically and emotionally demanding the show was to produce. Because it was filmed in front of a live studio audience, there was nowhere to hide. Every joke either landed or it did not, and when it did not, 300 to 500 people sitting in those studio seats made that failure completely visible and completely immediate. Ed O'Neill has spoken candidly in various interviews over the years about the psychological weight of that format. The live audience was electric when things went right, he has said, but when a scene fell flat, the silence was almost physically painful. Beyond the emotional pressure, there was the physical toll of the performance itself. Al Bundy was not a character who simply stood and delivered lines. He fell off furniture. He engaged in exaggerated physical fights. He performed broad slapstick comedy week after week, and he did it for 11 years. By the middle of the show's run, O'Neill was managing real physical pain that he pushed through because the production schedule left no room for recovery. He has described driving home from the studio some nights barely able to move, knowing he had to be back the following morning ready to be funny again in front of a live crowd. But the deepest cost was something more subtle. When you spend 11 years playing a man who has given up on life, some of that energy follows you home. Ed O'Neill has acknowledged in retrospect that the line between himself and Al Bundy became blurrier than he ever anticipated. Al's cynicism, his defeated worldview, his habit of expecting the worst from every situation, these were traits O'Neill had to inhabit completely every single week, and over time, fully shaking them off between episodes became genuinely difficult. He was not Al Bundy, but he spent more waking hours thinking, moving, and speaking like Al Bundy than he spent being himself. That kind of sustained immersion leaves marks that do not simply disappear when the cameras stop rolling. One of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of Married with Children is the relationship between Ed O'Neill and the character he protected. Over the course of the show's run, writers proposed various directions for Al Bundy that O'Neill pushed back against firmly. He understood something about the character that not everyone in the writer's room always grasped. Al Bundy could be lazy, selfish, crude, and spectacularly self-pitying. But he could not be genuinely cruel. He could not be mean-spirited in a way that removed his humanity entirely. This distinction mattered enormously. Al Bundy worked as a comedic figure because underneath all of his complaining and his insults and his spectacular failures, there was a recognizable human being. He loved his family in the inarticulate, fumbling way that a lot of people love their families. He never actually abandoned them, even when he fantasized about doing so in nearly every episode. He showed up, day after day, to a job he hated, in a life that had not given him what he wanted, and he kept going. That quiet persistence, buried under layers of sarcasm and self-deprecation, was the emotional core of the character. And Ed O'Neill guarded that core with a seriousness that people on the outside rarely saw. When writers pushed for material that he felt crossed the line from pathetic into genuinely cruel, he refused. This was not a small thing in a television production where stars are often expected to simply execute what is written for them. O'Neill used the authority he had built over years of carrying the show to protect something he believed in. The result was a character who remained sympathetic even at his worst, which is a far harder creative achievement than it appears. In 1989, Married with Children became the center of a national controversy when a conservative activist launched a campaign against the show's content, convincing major advertisers to withdraw their support. From the outside, it looked like a straightforward story about moral outrage and corporate caution. From the inside, it was something far more revealing about the cultural moment the show had accidentally captured. The campaign against the show did not kill it. Spectacularly, it did the opposite. Ratings climbed sharply as curious viewers tuned in to see what all the fuss was about. People who had never watched Married with Children suddenly needed to form an opinion about it, and many of them became loyal fans. Ed O'Neill later reflected on the irony of this with characteristic dryness, noting that the controversy amounted to the most effective free advertising the show ever received. But what the controversy actually revealed was something more significant than a marketing accident. It revealed the depth of the cultural nerve the show was touching. The people who were offended by Married with Children were offended because it refused to wrap family life in the comfortable, aspirational packaging that American television had spent decades perfecting. The people who loved it for exactly the same reason. It said out loud what a lot of families experience privately, that domestic life could be exhausting, frustrating, unglamorous, and still somehow worth showing up for. That was not a message that fit neatly into either a conservative or a progressive framework, which is part of why the show continued to confuse and unsettle critics throughout its entire run. There are moments in the history of any long-running production that quietly shift everything, that change the emotional texture of a workplace in ways that are never fully visible to the audience. For Married with Children, one of those moments came during the 6th season, when Katie Sagal, who played Peg Bundy with such sharp and committed comedic energy, suffered a devastating personal loss. The pregnancy that had been written into the show's storyline ended in tragedy, and the production had to pivot overnight, rewriting the story into a surreal dream sequence that allowed the show to continue without addressing what had actually happened. Ed O'Neill has spoken about that period with a heaviness that cuts through even his typically measured public persona. He has admitted that he did not know how to respond in the way that the situation called for, that he defaulted to silence when something more present and more human was needed. It is the kind of regret that does not dissolve with time. The show went on. The jokes continued. The live audience kept laughing. But the people behind the cameras were carrying something that never made it onto the screen and never should have had to. This is one of the things that most fans genuinely never figured out about Married with Children. The show was about a family performing functionality while quietly managing dysfunction. And at certain points during its 11-year run, the cast was doing exactly the same thing. When Married with Children was canceled in 1997, the cast found out not through any formal communication from the network, but through second-hand information filtering in from the outside world. There was no farewell episode, no final gathering, no acknowledgement of what 11 years of television had built. The show simply stopped, and the people who had made it were left to process that ending on their own terms. Ed O'Neill has described his reaction to that moment with a kind of flat, unsentimental clarity that makes it land harder than any dramatic telling could. He gave the network his best years, he has said, and one day he simply stopped existing to them. The parallel to Al Bundy, a man who gave everything to a life that never acknowledged what he sacrificed, was not lost on him. It was, in some ways, the show's thesis statement delivered in real life. What Ed O'Neill has spent years trying to help people understand is that Al Bundy was not a figure to be admired or imitated. He was a figure to be recognized. He was the part of American life that gets edited out of the version of ourselves we prefer to present publicly. The exhaustion, the disappointment, the gap between what we hoped for and what we got. Millions of people saw themselves in him, not because they wanted to be him, but because he made it safe to admit that life is harder than the television usually acknowledges. Modern Family gave O'Neill a second chapter, a character who found warmth and connection and genuine joy in family life. He has said that playing Jay Pritchett helped him understand Al Bundy more clearly in retrospect. The contrast between the two men illuminated what Married with Children had really been about all along. Not the cynicism, not the insults, not the couch and the hand down the pants, but the stubborn, unglamorous, unacknowledged act of showing up anyway. That, in the end, is what most fans never fully figured out. And that is exactly why, decades later, people are still talking about it.